Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I hope your new year is off to a great start. The celebrations are over. It's time to get back to the important issues impacting our society. As of this recording, we still don't have a Speaker of the House. They're on the third vote now. Not sure how that's going to play out, but it will be interesting to see because history is being made. This hasn't happened since, I believe, 1923. So I'm going to be very curious to see how it all plays out, and I'll put out another episode discussing it. Now, on Monday's episode, I spoke with Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, and during our discussion, he brought up an excellent point that I think is worth revisiting. So take a listen to this.
Historically, I mean, if you look at the Roman Empire, you could argue that by 40 AD, people thought it was over with. There was no way they were going to survive the Principate. And maybe by 80 AD, they thought, how can you survive Caligula or Nero and Galba and Otho all in 1 year? But they did. And then they had the Vespasian and then era, and then they had the five good emperors. But each time they had a cycle of reform, there was less vibrance. They were always trying to get back to where they had been rather than to advance beyond that. So that's it's worrisome. And our problem right now is we have so much ignorance in the country. We have a whole shadow population of 200 million people who, if you say to them, it's Thanksgiving, you know what that is? Do you know who Abraham Lincoln was? Do you know what the Battle of Gettysburg, what was D-Day? They have no idea. And they're completely ignorant of it. And the Democratic Party wants them that way. So I think there will be a correction. It's just a question, do people have the fortitude and the energy to go back, not to where we were in 2010, which was bad, but go back to where we were prior to 1995, maybe go back to the 80s or something. I think we can do it.
We were talking about if there's going to be a course correction, if people are going to wake up and realize what's going on and decide that we need a massive change. And I think it's important that if you didn't listen to the episode, I suggest you do, because Dr. Hanson is an intellectual giant, and he is someone that's right on the money. If we want a correct course, we can't say that we need to go back to the policies of a few years ago. I get it. Some of those policies were good and beneficial to the United States. I'm not ignoring that. However, the sad reality is that many of the most important problems, they were still ignored or they got even worse. One of the problems is the financial health of the United States, and that's what I want to focus on in this episode. Our politicians have abdicated their responsibilities when it comes to being good stewards of our hard-earned tax dollars. They spend an enormous amount of money, and they have shown that they have no regard for how they spend your money. That is clear. They don't even pass budgets in regular order, and they continue to raise the debt ceiling without any real debate. It's always if we have to, or else it's going to be doom and gloom. And if we continue to trend, it's only going to be a matter of time before the entire house of cards collapses, turning what is the wealthiest nation in the world into a country like Zimbabwe. Listen, I'm someone that's going to give it to you straight, and the blame lies with both parties. Republicans talked a good game when it came to fiscal responsibility, but the fact is that when they were in power, they spent just as much as Democrats did. And in this episode, I want to discuss the fiscal disaster. I want to explain how those in power don't care about how they spend your money. More importantly, I want to focus on the things we could do to restore fiscal sanity. It's not that hard to actually fix this problem. The biggest obstacle is whether the politicians and the people have the cojones and the will to do it before it's too late. Before I jump in, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. If you find the show informative, share it with your family and friends. And I want to hear from you. So write a review on Apple Podcasts or drop me an email, podcast@PASreport.com, because I want your feedback. I appreciate it. I enjoy all the feedback I get. And I have to say, the PAS Report audience is the best audience out there. Now, time and time again, Republicans preach about being fiscally responsible. And then what happens? Well, 18 of them turn around and vote for a 4,000-page bill in the United States Senate without reading the damn thing. We have 4,000-page bills coming out 3 days before they're voted on. And shame on both parties for doing that. The reason I decided to do this episode was that last week I was part of the Mornings with Maria panel on Fox Business, and we interviewed Congressman French Hill. He represents Arkansas's 2nd Congressional District, and here's what I asked him, and here's his response. Take a listen. And Congressman, we've seen spending increase under Republican Congresses and Democrat Congresses. Now that we head into 2023, how is the House Republican Congress going to win back the trust of the American people when it comes to fiscal responsibility and fiscal restraint?
Well, first, I think we need to do the appropriations bills on time, one at a time, and have those debates in committee and try to constrain those forms of spending that were tied to the pandemic. There are billions of dollars that we've spent over the last couple of years due to the pandemic. Let's draw that back. Let's target each agency and go back to see where they were in FY19 and FY20 and try to determine if they can continue to function at that level, and then concentrate on the things where we need to spend money, like in national defense and rebuilding our stocks and supplies, and in border security, for example, and be perhaps more generous there, as Mitch McConnell commented on in his statement. That's the kind of priorities that we need to set, and we need to do that by passing those appropriations one at a time, and look at the opportunity for budget reforms that Nancy Pelosi refused to implement. I think that would be great. Steve Womack of Arkansas had some great suggestions on how to reform the whole budget process and make it more transparent and more accountable to the American people.
With all due respect to the congressman, that was a non-answer. As I stated, Republicans, they always preach about fiscal responsibility, yet they spend just as much as Democrats. Time and again, they say one thing and do the exact opposite when it comes to how they spend your money. I asked directly how the Republican-led House in the 118th Congress would restore the trust that Republicans lost when it comes to the idea of fiscal responsibility. And he responded that we need to go back to the pre-COVID spending levels, get back to 2019 and 2020. That's the problem right there. It's not like the debt and deficit just exploded during the pandemic. It was exploding long before that. And we were overspending then too, running deficits in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Not once did he bring up the idea of a balanced budget. Not once did he talk about the national debt. Not once did he talk about actually cutting spending, gutting programs that exist. And I appreciate him talking about introducing standalone appropriation bills. I appreciate him talking about stopping the massive omnibus spending packages, doing away with the continuing resolutions as a stopgap measure to fund the government. But we need to be talking about concrete solutions to the problem, not mere words. We need to talk about a radical overhaul. And even in his response, he talks about spending more money on programs like national defense. Sorry, but we need to seriously look at the defense budget rather than just blindly increase the budget as we've done for the last 30, 40, 50 years. The amount of money wasted within the bureaucracy is insane, and we should immediately freeze all budgets, including defense, until we have realistic proposals to rein in this spending. If you want to know how bad the problem is, just take a look at Senator Rand Paul's 2022 Festivus report. He lays out a whopping $482 billion of wasteful spending. $482 billion with a B. You want to know what some of the things our officials wasted your tax dollars on? You want to know why it shows that they don't care about how they spend your money just as long as they spend it? When it comes to COVID relief money, we saw an enormous amount of waste, giving $4.5 billion to those who were ineligible to receive COVID assistance grants. This was done through the Small Business Administration. I mean, you had money going to farm businesses that don't even operate on U.S. soil. How are you going to get that money back? Well, you're not. That's the problem. Broward County, Florida, received a ton of COVID stimulus money. What are they spending $140 million on? Well, they're spending $140 million in COVID relief funds on a luxury hotel that includes a rooftop bar and an 11,000 square foot spa and fitness center overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. When it comes to the Department of Defense, you know, the same Department of Defense that has a sacred budget where politicians constantly defend the spending increases. Well, let's take a look at what they're spending money on. They spent $9 million on funding a 1.5-mile park in Austin, Texas that's used for yoga and concerts. They spent $192,000 on Starbucks espresso machines. Imagine, must be nice working for the Pentagon. You have the nice Starbucks espresso machines? Must be nice. You have the DoD spending $28 million on camouflage uniforms to use in the desert environment of Afghanistan. But the problem with these uniforms was that they were forest patterned. And when the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction looked into the purchase, he stated it was a dumb decision because they can't be used in Afghanistan. Forget that it was a dumb decision. Was anyone held accountable for this incompetence? If you know anything about the Department of Defense procurement process, you know how many people had to sign off on this purchase, how many dozens of hands it had to go through, and not a single one flagged it. And I challenge you, just Google the DoD procurement flowchart, and you'll see for yourself. This is total incompetence, and yet who's been punished for it? And it reminds me of how the Department of Defense wasted money on studying why coffee spills when someone walks, or when Congress rammed through $136 million for upgrades to the M1 Abrams tank for the M1A2 SEP variant, even though you had General Odierno back in 2015 state that the M1 Abrams tank is largely outdated and the upgrades are completely unnecessary for today's battlefield. But we pushed it through anyway. $42 million is being earmarked for the Department of Defense's Star-Based Youth Program. The program's designed to teach STEM fields to at-risk youth near military bases. And this program, while it may have some merit, why is the DoD running these types of programs? Shouldn't this be reserved for the states to do? And there's no real reporting requirements to determine how many youths attend this program and whether they're tracked to determine whether this program has led to those attending achieving higher levels of success in life. Well, wouldn't that be nice to know, to see if we need to continue this program, since this program has been around since 2001? And trust me on this, we have several agencies and departments running redundant STEM programs as well. So why don't we consolidate all these STEM programs into one program? Not sure I understand that logic, but it's government. There is no logic. Because you have the Department of Defense getting $25 million to modernize 3 literal combat ships, also known as LCS. Now, these LCS ships are supposedly an inside joke within the Navy, and some refer to LCS as little crappy ships. Kind of tells you everything you need to know, so why are we wasting $25 million on it? So spare me the idea that we can't afford to put some cuts into the defense budget. But it's not just the DoD, it's every agency and department. We spent $1.7 billion on abandoned federal buildings and storage facilities. You have USAID allocated more than $210 million to fund basic education programs, not in the United States, not for Americans, but in Jordan for Jordanians. The Department of Health and Human Services awarded the Vera Institute of Justice $168 million on a 1-year contract to provide free legal services to illegal immigrants and assist them in avoiding deportation. Really? Last I checked, this wasn't in the Department of Health and Human Services mission statement. This is part of the problem. And not for nothing, I'm an American. Where's my free legal services? I just got 2 tickets in D.C. from speeding cameras that cost a fortune. So do I get free legal representation for that? You have the Department of Transportation spending more than $70 million to subsidize the Staten Island ferry. Now, the ferry ride is free for passengers. 25 million people a year take the Staten Island ferry. Think about that. You could charge each passenger a fare of $3, which is extraordinarily cheap in today's day and age. And that would have been enough to give them $75 million. But instead, they're using all taxpayer money. And how many of those Americans that are funding this never even heard of the Staten Island ferry? We spent $50 million to encourage tourism, not in the United States, but in Tunisia. In Tunisia, $17 million on empty hotel rooms for immigrants, $3 million to build the Mahatma Gandhi Museum. The National Institute of Health, one of my favorites, always the worst offender out of all. Them and the National Science Foundation, those are the 2 worst. You have the NIH spending $3 million giving hamsters steroids and watching them fight. They spent $2.3 million on injecting puppies with cocaine, $2.1 million on encouraging Ethiopians to wear shoes, $1.1 million on getting mice drunk. It wasn't enough to spend millions of dollars on getting monkeys to drink alcohol excessively. Another $187,000 to study whether kids love their pets. And don't forget, this is the same division where Dr. Fauci approved funding for a lab in Tunisia that cut the vocal cords off beagles, covering their heads and then injecting hungry sandflies so that the insects could eat the beagles alive. At what point do we begin to talk about disbanding the NIH? Because that's what needs to happen. Again, the Department of Health and Human Services spending $700,000 to study romance between parrots. The National Science Foundation spent about the same amount to compare ant and human brain development. You have the National Science Foundation spent $119,000 to study if Thanos could snap his fingers in real life, even though Thanos is a fictional character from the Avengers comics. You have the Department of Agriculture spending $491,000 to boost the hard cider market. Talk about insane. You look at this omnibus package that just passed. We provide Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, Oman, $410 million of your taxpayer dollars for enhanced border security. That should enrage every one of you. Think about how insulting that is. We can't enforce our border. If you talk about border security here in the United States, you get labeled as a xenophobe, a bigot, or a racist. But securing the borders of foreign countries, well, that's a much more important priority than the American people. We provide $1.5 billion to Border Patrol for border management. But those funds, they're not allowed to be used to secure the border. They're not allowed to be used to hire new permanent Border Patrol agents. The funds must be used to improve the processing of migrants and illegal immigrants. This is what we've been reduced to. They work harder for everyone else than the American people that they swore to serve. You have Senator McConnell touting this omnibus bill as if it's a good thing. And to show you how out of touch he is, he explains how this bill and the funding of the Ukraine is the number one priority for the Republicans. Oh yeah? Have you taken a poll amongst Republicans? Amongst ordinary members of the Republican Party? I have to ask, when do America and the American people, when do we become a priority? When do we become the top priority? I'd like to know that, and I think my audience would love to know that as well. To date, we have given the Ukraine about $113 billion. This is 15% of what we spent in 8 years of war in Iraq in 2003. Then you look at Europe. Europe as a whole has provided about $25 billion. For the existential threat that Putin and Russia are, why isn't Europe shouldering more of the burden? Why don't they see this as such an existential threat as we do? Are we allowed to ask that question yet? More importantly, nobody talks about what's the end game here. Every time you question the amount of money we have provided to Ukraine, bring up oversight. You have the public virtue signalers out there. They viciously attack you. You're a Putin lover. You support totalitarianism. You want to destroy democracy. But when you push back against these people, you find that there's nothing there. They operate solely through emotion. They don't have answers to important questions. And one of the questions is, what is the purpose? What is our end game? Smart policies come with smart objectives that are simple, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So what are our goals and objectives in the Ukraine? Notice that not a single government official can tell us what the objective is in any coherent manner. And what happens when you don't have smart objectives? Well, Afghanistan, that's what happens. When the objectives morphed into building a stable and democratic Afghanistan, that's when it failed. It didn't work out for us. Now, some people will push back and say, well, the objective is to get rid of Putin. Okay, so you're saying that the United States policy is now advocating regime change in Russia. And what happens if Putin doesn't go willingly? How far are we willing to take it? Who would take over in the event that Putin does go? In Putin's demise, what happens if the person that steps up to the plate is even worse? Others are going to argue that the objective is to get Russia to completely withdraw from all of Ukraine, including the Crimea. Okay, if that's the objective, well, what happens if Russia doesn't do it? What happens if they continue in this quagmire where Ukraine can't really fully win and declare victory? They're not going to have the full, complete surrender of Russia, and Russia keeps pushing. What do you do then? And when you bring up the idea of a diplomatic solution, which would actually benefit everyone, they outright reject it. You can't negotiate with dictators like Putin. And that argument is so shallow. We negotiate with dictators all the time. We've negotiated with dictators in the past, and we continue to do so. But that's one area where we can't have a diplomatic solution. And so the next set of questions, well, let's put numbers on things. How much more money and assistance are we going to provide? How long are we going to continue to let the war go on? How deep is our commitment going to be? And their response is always vague generalities like, as long as it takes, as long as it takes. And that's not steeped in any sort of reality. They don't use logic or reason. They just operate through emotion. What if this goes on for another year? Are we willing to spend another $115 billion? What if it goes on for 2 years, 5 years? What happens if the war begins to expand because nobody's providing a diplomatic solution? I mean, these are all questions that we should be asking. What's in the best interest of the United States? Is what's in the best interest of the United States, does it align with what's in the best interest of Ukraine? Or what's in the best or worst interest of Russia? I mean, these are all questions we should be exploring, but you're not allowed to ask questions because it's a brave new world. See, what is so hard for them to see is, as the emotion drives their positions, is that we should be focusing on what's in our best interest. Here in the United States, Russia has been weakened. All the money we've provided to Ukraine, we now have enormous leverage over them. So let's force the two to the table. Let's find a diplomatic solution. Let's begin to reintroduce some semblance of stability back into the international system. That would do everyone some good. But of course, you have those who deny the obvious. They'll argue, we have plenty of money. We could just give it to everyone else in the world. Take care of everyone else in the world's priorities. Not our own, but their priorities. That we are the world's wealthiest nation, so we must give back. And while we are the world's wealthiest nation, while that's true as of now, it's not going to remain that way if we continue down this trend. Because when we're looking at the trend, you have to consider our debt to GDP ratio. In the 1920s, our debt to GDP ratio hovered in the teens. Following World War II in 1945, the debt to GDP ratio was 114%. 1946, it rose to 119%. But throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the debt to GDP level hovered between the low 30 percentile to the 40 percentiles. In 2009, we saw the debt to GDP ratio explode with the mortgage meltdown, the bank bailouts. It would go over 90%, and eventually, throughout the course of the Obama administration, it would cross the 100% barrier. It continued throughout the Trump administration. So again, it's both parties are responsible for this. The debt to GDP ratio continued, and obviously it's continuing under the Biden administration, where it now sits at a whopping 123%, and it's growing. Some say that the current debt to GDP ratio is about 130%, and some argue it's already surpassed that. Then you have people trying to make comparisons that the debt to GDP ratio, it's not that bad. It's similar to World War II. But you can't compare the two. The fact is that we were combating the Depression throughout the 1930s. We fought a massive war in the World War II. The government didn't subsidize and fund all the states at the time. They didn't fund all these initiatives and studies like they do today. The federal apparatus didn't have its tentacles on all aspects of life and businesses like it does now. Today, our debt isn't from a world war. It's from never-ending wars like Afghanistan. That's a small part of it. But it's more from the explosion of spending at the federal level, instituting new program after new program after new program. It's from the government funding a bunch of nonprofits that are supposed to be apolitical, but they're anything but. It's from funding just about every single research project at our institutions. It's from forcing people to become wholly dependent on the government for their livelihoods. This is why our debt has exploded. Following World War II, both Republicans and Democrats understood the importance of bringing down the debt to GDP ratio. Today, our politicians scream about spending more money that we don't have. They call for more spending, more programs, more initiatives. And if we factor in all the unfunded liabilities that the United States has, the unfunded liabilities versus GDP, it's over 400%. You want to talk about a ticking time bomb that gets repeatedly ignored by both sides? Well, this is it. We're going to take a short break, and when we get back, I'm going to talk about how we actually solve this problem. However, solving the problem isn't really that complicated, and the main thing is to control and cut spending. Knock off the stupid crap of wasting money on things like I mentioned before. Giving hamsters steroids and watching them battle it out. Do we really need to do that? Is that really a priority? Oh, but that's just a drop in the bucket. That's like pennies on the dollar. Yeah, and it's that logic that's got us into this mess. One of the biggest drawbacks of the bureaucracy is not just the waste, fraud, and abuse within the system when it comes to government programs, but it's the lack of efficiency and effectiveness. And while some government programs do have good intent, the reality is that most never achieve the objectives they were created for, yet they continue to go on and on and on. They don't solve the problem that they were intended to solve. We need a complete audit of every single government program, and those programs that fail to achieve their objectives need to be terminated immediately. And this has to come from a third party. You can't have the government checking itself because they've proven that they're frauds. Just think, every year we invest more and more money into drug prevention and treatment programs. In fact, on the federal level alone, we have 72 programs. Imagine if we factored in state and local programs, nonprofit programs, for-profit programs. Yet even though we have all these programs on drug prevention and treatment, substance abuse continues to rise, and so does the number of deaths from illegal narcotics. Obviously, these programs are not achieving the goals that they were designed for. Yet rather than do away with or revamp the programs to be more effective, we simply just throw more money at the problem. Create new programs that overlap with the same old failed programs. Doesn't make any sense to any logical person. You look at our education system. When you look at our education system, you'll see that our education programs are in no way efficient or effective. We spend over $1.3 trillion a year on education. It's not like we're achieving all that much success, especially when you look at our proficiency numbers. Students lack basic proficiency levels in nearly all subject areas. So we're not educating students. When you look at the dollars invested into each student, you'll see that the cost versus benefit analysis isn't making much sense anymore. Yet rather than revamp it, what do we hear? Oh, it's because the schools need more money. My district alone has a $200 million school budget. That's insane to me. That's insane. It shouldn't cost that much to educate children, and it doesn't. It's money that's being wasted. We have 3 agencies that inspect catfish to make sure that they're safe for consumption. Why do you need 3 federal employees looking at the same damn catfish? Why can't we just have one agency do it? It's dumb stuff like that that needs to be eliminated within the system. If we begin to eliminate entire agencies, we could begin to mount a realistic effort of tackling the national debt. Rather than growing the federal apparatus, how about we downsize it? And that's going to have 2 enormous benefits to our country as a whole. It would put us on a path toward fiscal responsibility, and at the same time, it would reduce the power and abuse of the government. The second thing we should do is tie congressional salaries to the annual deficit. Now, the odds of this happening are remote, I give it that, and I don't envision that members of Congress would be so willing to do this, but we should push for a constitutional amendment. It would probably have to be an Article 5 Convention of States type amendment, but think about it. Let's say for every year Congress runs a deficit, their salaries should be reduced by 10%. So if they are making $175,000, they run a deficit, their salaries should be reduced by $17,000, where their salaries will shrink to $158,000. If they run a deficit next year, well, then their pay is reduced by another $15,000, bringing their salary to $143,000. And we could even include a stipulation that if they run budget surpluses and start paying down the debt in that fiscal year, then they could receive a 4% pay increase the subsequent year. I have no problem with that. If you tie their salaries to the deficit and debt, watch how quickly members of Congress, watch how quickly they all become fiscally responsible. They become sticklers for every penny that's being spent. Every member of Congress would be a fiscal hawk because they would know that their livelihood is on the line as well. Another thing that we could do is that we have to make sure that our money is spent wisely. For that, we should pressure Congress to include provisions within any piece of spending legislation that when it comes to appropriations and creating new government programs, these programs have to be reviewed by an outside auditor. If the program fails to meet its objectives within the first 5 years, that program automatically gets terminated. It does not take a new act by Congress to terminate the program. It automatically sunsets and goes away. See, the problem today is that once a program is instituted, it exists forever, regardless of whether if it's beneficial or not. It's impossible to terminate government programs. However, if you include termination at the birth of a new program, if you include it at the outset, it would be much easier to get rid of the useless government programs that exist. Term limits. Term limits are another great idea. Term limits are essential to restoring some fiscal responsibility. Members of Congress, they would be less influenced by dark money. They would be less beholden to their party's spending priorities. This wouldn't be easy. Okay, again, term limits is not something that Congress is really pushing for. It would probably need to be done. Again, Article 5, Convention of States, great process. I did an episode on that when I first started the podcast. I'll put another one out soon on it. But if there is one thing that unites the American people, regardless of political ideology, it's term limits. Now, these are 4 things we could do to begin to tackle the debt. And I'm going to speak more at length about these in future episodes, but while politicians have no regard for how they spend your money, we cannot put all the blame on them. Because the 5th, the most important thing, is to look inward. We, the people, are a major part of the problem as we constantly look towards the government to solve every single problem that exists. We constantly pressure the government to institute new programs, and yet then we'll bitch and complain about the government. I brought up the idea that my school district is $200 million budget. I just got my property tax bill, and it increased dramatically. Now, here's the kicker. Everyone in my area complains about property taxes. Everyone on Long Island will always complain about property taxes because they're enormously high, yet every single school budget always passes. Without fail, they pass. So whose fault is that? Doesn't it become our fault? Many believe that there's a government solution to everything, that the government has to be responsible for everything, but understand the government cannot be responsible for every little thing in our society. That we can't just keep throwing money, good money, after bad programs. Can't do it. And if we look at our past, we could find many of the answers. Take Grover Cleveland and Calvin Coolidge, two great presidents, one a Democrat, the other Republican. Calvin Coolidge understood that debt burdens the people, not the government. And he said, quote, "I favor the policy of economy, not because I wish to save money, but because I wish to save people. The men and women of this country who toil are the ones who bear the cost of the government. Every dollar that we carelessly waste means that their life will be so much more meager. Every dollar that we prudently save means that their life will be so much more abundant. Economy is idealism in its most practical form." You have Grover Cleveland. He wrote an article, The Waste of Public Money. In the article, he states, quote, "If the aggregate mass of the people are at all blameworthy on account of the present advanced stage of public prodigality, it is largely because they overlooked and tolerated its small beginnings, when at all times they should have been vigilant and uncompromising. A self-ruling people should constantly remember that nothing multiplies itself more abundantly than national extravagance, and that neither an individual nor a popular government can easily correct or check habits of waste." He went on to explain how we the people are bought and paid for because we're guilty of accepting the bribes of selfish and personal advantage which public waste and extravagance offer. And though the people support the government should not support the people. And what he's saying is that you shouldn't be able to live off the government. The government doesn't exist to support every aspect of your life. Again, the answers and the solutions are there for us. The question is, do we have the will to do something about it? And that's the question. I hope you found this episode informative. And if you do, I appreciate a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Take 30 seconds to write a good review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back on Monday. I got a great guest coming in, and it will be another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.